For this weekend's shipwreck video, we'll be continuing the recent theme, a Nautilus survey and then a compilation video, with this one being similar to the last one, except instead of looking at the scuttling of the high seas fleet, we'll be turning to battleships that blew apart in port. There's been several examples of this over the years, more than you might think actually. There's the famous ones, of course, such as Maine, Mutsu, or Vanguard. And then there's the lesser known ones like Leonardo da Vinci or Novorossiysk. But there were quite a few others even beyond those. The Italian battleship Benedetto Brin, the Russian Imperatrista Maria, Japan's Kawachi and Mikasa, Britain's HMS Bulwark, and the French Iéna and Liberté, all of which are generally overlooked compared to the more famous options. You'd be forgiven for not knowing Mikasa suffered an explosion at all, being as that ship is still around. Regardless, in today's video, we'll be looking at 3 of those wrecks. At some point, I'll also cover Maine, but that won't be today. And how much you consider her a battleship varies on who you ask. The others simply lack enough in the way of photos to justify individual videos, even Vanguard. That aside, the main focus will be, in order, Da Vinci, Novorossiysk, and Mutsu. The first 2 in particular are interesting for being sister ships, a rare direct comparison that you don't normally see in a situation like this. Their third sister, Cavour, is another one that I may cover at some point, if I can find enough images of her final sinking. With that established, let's get into things, starting, as said, with Leonardo da Vinci. Also, I apologize for how rough my voice is. I'm probably fighting something off. The last of 3 Conte di Cavour class battleships, Leonardo da Vinci did not lead a charmed life. Completed in May 1914 and lost to a magazine explosion 2 years later, she had an incredibly short service, especially for a ship not sunk by enemy action. Probably. There's quite a bit of debate on that subject, even a century later. In today's video, we'll be looking at the sinking of Da Vinci, but also at her salvage. Not a traditional shipwreck video, hence the Saturday upload, but still one focused more on the wreck due to the plain lack of service. That said, I will cover Leo's service history, as much as there is to cover considering the situation. Before that, though, a disclaimer. If you've been with this channel from the start, you might be going, wait, didn't you do this already? And yes, I did. 2 years ago, almost. One of my first videos, and it needed a reprise. Especially now with my greater experience with shipwreck videos. Look at this like the Etzel one or the Espero one, where I covered an older video in a better format. And in addition, to bring this in line with the more recent videos on Cavour and Cesare. That disclaimer done, let's look at Leonardo da Vinci's short service life. The ship that became Da Vinci was laid down on July 18, 1910. She would then be launched on October 14, 1911. This was a pretty speedy construction process. It would slow down a lot in the fitting out, mostly due to delays in procuring armor plate and the main battery, something that slowed down all the Italian dreadnoughts, but especially the 3 Cavours. This delay meant that Da Vinci wasn't completed until May 17th of 1914, which is the point to talk about what kind of ship the Italians got. This will be brief, as I've covered this class twice over now. Da Vinci displaced around 23,150 tons at her standard loading, and about 25,000 tons at the full load. On that displacement, the ship carried 13 305mm 12-inch guns and 5 turrets, 3 triples and 2 twins, and a superfiring pair ahead of the bridge, and another superfiring pair on the stern. Those superfiring pairs saw a twin turret mounted above a triple. The 5th turret, another triple, was mounted amidships. To support those, the battleship carried 18 single 120mm or 4.7-inch guns, in typical hull-mounted casements. The guns were rounded off by a further 14 76mm weapons, carried on top of the turrets and on the deck. And because this was an old-school dreadnought, Da Vinci also carried 3 submerged torpedo tubes, one on either broadside with a third in the stern. All of this was protected by a main belt of 80 to 250 millimeters in thickness, 3.1 to 9.8 inches. To finish off the design, the ship could reach 21.5 knots on 31,000 shaft horsepower through 4 shafts. With all of that out of the way, let's look at what Da Vinci got up to after she was handed over to the Regia Marina. For the most part, she was kept in port for the entirety of her short career. If you know your history, this isn't surprising. Da Vinci entered service shortly before the Great War began. Admittedly, the Italians were neutral for the start of that conflict, but that didn't mean their fleet was going out and about. It remained at home for the most part, and when Italy did join the war on May 23, 1915, well, things didn't change much. The Italian fleet as a whole remained in port for most of the conflict. Italian leadership was concerned about the tight confines of the Adriatic, and had no desire to lose their limited dreadnoughts to torpedoes from torpedo boats or submarines. So, to quote the original video, the Italian fleet stuck around the southern Adriatic, flinging "come out and fight me" at the Austrians, who didn't take the bait for the majority of the war. In addition to the torpedo concern, Italy had a severe coal shortage. Most powers did, and that meant importing coal was difficult. It reached the point the Navy's stock of good coal was rated to keep factories running. So, with limited fuel and torpedo concerns, Leonardo da Vinci saw no combat. She only rarely left port, and even then it was just for gunnery training. Most of her time was spent at anchor, doing nothing, which would be the same as her sister ships were it not for one little problem: her sinking. Much like Cesare decades later, Da Vinci blew up in port. This happened on August 2nd, 1916, and has been a bit of a mystery ever since. The Italians, presumably out of a mix of embarrassment and wounded pride, immediately blamed the Austrians. And in fairness, most countries would blame enemy sabotage when at war. It was also possible that it was an accident, either faulty powder, poor powder handling, or both. It's difficult to say for sure with any certainty. An accidental explosion is probably more likely than Austrian saboteurs sneaking aboard and sabotaging the ship, especially with the Italians using British-style powder when HMS Vanguard, no, not that Vanguard, exploded in port, in similar, if much more dramatic fashion. Although that doesn't rule sabotage out, or even rule out a combination of poor powder, bad handling, and Austrian sabotage. Either way, 21 officers and 227 sailors would die in this explosion. Da Vinci capsized in place, much like Cesare and Cavour would decades later. This class is 343 in capsizing, actually, although Da Vinci is more like Cesare in this case. In any event, the explosion opened 2 large holes in the ship's hull. It also wrecked the deck around the aft triple turret. Between this damage and the wrecked watertight bulkheads, the ship was completely open to the water. Even her boiler spaces flooded, because the tunnels for the prop shafts were open. The ship sank so quickly that a lot of hatches were open as well and couldn't be closed, further compounding the issue. In fact, Da Vinci sank within 10 minutes. That gave little time for any reaction, let alone any damage control efforts. The force of capsizing into the mud beneath her led to the superstructure breaking apart, while the turrets and conning tower remained in place, driven into the mud. After the sinking, those just drove in deeper as the weight of the hull pushed them down. While the bow remained above water after the sinking, this gradually vanished as the ship sank deeper. Eventually, Da Vinci was buried in the mud at a slight angle, and completely sunk with only about 3 meters of the bow remaining above water. For most navies, this would have seen the ship left in place, or broken up. The Italians went for a different route. In a Herculean effort of engineering and sheer bullheaded stubbornness, they set to work. While multiple different options were put forth, in the end the choice was made to make the ship airtight and raise her from the bottom, without trying to right her first. An operation, again, strikingly similar to Cesare 40 years later. The initial process was slow, with Italian industry already overloaded, just supplying their war effort. When resources were finally sufficient to begin the salvage, it was 1917. This operation started by setting up equipment to blow compressed air into the remaining watertight spaces. This started lowering the water level and made it possible for workers to remove the remaining ammunition from the bow and amidships magazines, along with emptying the coal bunkers, further lightening the ship, and retrieving some of that ever-important coal. These actions did break the ship from the mud, but it wasn't enough. The holes from the explosion remained an issue. As such, divers set out to seal all the underwater holes in the battleship's hulk, from damage or just openings that couldn't be closed in time before Da Vinci sank. In particular, attention was placed on the holes caused by the explosion, which, as you can imagine, took a lot of work to seal. When this was complete, the Italians went a step further and repeatedly raised and lowered the ship with compressed air to work the turrets and guns free. This was because the heavy turrets made the process of raising the ship even more difficult than it already was. All this work would lower her weight by something in the range of 6,000 tons. The turrets, for their part, would be left in the mud for later salvage, as you can see here. All of this work continued into 1919, when, with the aid of flotation cylinders to help with buoyancy, the ship would be raised over the course of September. Leonardo da Vinci would be afloat again, albeit upside down, on September 17th of 1919. Still upside down, she would be moved into dry dock and placed above wooden shoring to support her hull. As no ship is designed to be upside down in general, and certainly not out of the water, her decks could not support the weight on their own. Left like this for over a year, the Italian engineers would repair the remaining damage, and drain the remaining water to clear out the mud and debris of the sinking, along with recovering the remains of those trapped inside when the battleship went under. When this was done, the battleship was put back in the water on January 21st, 1921. Still capsized at this point, of course. The Italians then towed Da Vinci to a trench they dug up for this exact purpose. They filled the ship's starboard double bottom to force her to roll over again, except this time back to the normal orientation. With careful support from submarines and lighters, the ship was rolled over, until she reached enough of an angle to naturally right herself, ultimately ending on January 24th, 1921. Leonardo da Vinci was upright once more, although with a list to starboard. That was cleared up by emptying the water that was pumped inside. Considering the list was 22 degrees, it did take a bit of work. After that was corrected, she was towed back to dock and left there as her fate was decided and her turrets were recovered, which required the Italians to design an entirely new donut-shaped device to do so. This is also the point where we move from her salvage into the question that bedeviled the Italians: what to do with this hulk now that they'd gotten her back to normal. Da Vinci was, by this point, an obsolescent ship. The other Cavours were still in service, but mostly because they couldn't be replaced. Even just returning Da Vinci to their standard would have been hilariously expensive, modernization even more so. So, what to do? At this point, multiple suggestions were put forth. The simplest and easiest was restoring the ship to her original design, with whatever improvements had been made in the intervening years, like a new mast trialed on Dante. The result would be a third Cavour, nothing better or worse than the other two ships, which were already a bit obsolescent in 1921. In all honesty, this option was probably the worst choice. It would be rebuilding a ship that would need modernization later, in addition to the cost of restoring her in the first place. The second option was still simple, but arguably more interesting, replacing the amidships turret with a set of 6 4-inch anti-aircraft guns. Actually remarkably forward-thinking of the Italians, although this also wasn't taken up. In fairness, those guns would need to be replaced eventually, and now you've lost one of the main battery turrets, for maybe a slight increase in speed from the lightning of the ship. It might also have made a future rebuild easier. But, of course, the Italians wouldn't know that they were going to do such a massive rebuild on the other two ships. Past those suggestions, I haven't come across any serious alternatives. The ship could have, theoretically, been converted into a small carrier. However, there's no evidence of this being pursued. Da Vinci would have made for a poor conversion in all likelihood. So, in spite of the heroic salvage effort, the ship would ultimately be scrapped in 1923. Unsurprising, as even the simplest option, a full restoration, would have cost 60 million lira, well more than Italy could afford at the time. And with the French conspiring to lose a dreadnought to running her aground, well, I can't blame Italy here. And if nothing else, the salvage of this ship would establish quite a few techniques used later. From Scapa Flow to Pearl Harbor to Cesare. That's not a bad legacy for Leonardo da Vinci, even if the ship never saw combat. Unfortunately, that legacy applying to Cesare is what we're moving to now. That ship would survive the Second World War with relatively little in the way of damage. As for Cesare, she would also be taken away, given to the Soviets as a war prize, where her fate would be less than pleasant. We'll be getting into that now. The actual shipwreck portion will be like Tirpitz or Mutsu, focused on the salvage of a battleship sunk in shallow water. However, there will be a bit more put on the sinking this time around, because this is a sinking that still comes up with conspiracy theories almost 70 years later, while the simplest answer is probably the official one given by the Soviets. That doesn't stop the theories, ranging from Italian frogmen playing James Bond to hidden explosives going off a decade late, or alternatively, both of those together. It's pretty much impossible to say with any real certainty. Nonetheless, I'll cover that sinking in this video, along with the salvage of the wreck, beginning, of course, with the sinking, and a little bit of background on how the ship ended up in that position. You see, the battleship Novorossiysk began her life under a different flag, the Italian flag to be specific, as the battleship Giulio Cesare, probably one of the most famous Italian battleships, not named Roma, because of her engagement with Warspite at Calabria for the historical aspect, and for being an utterly broken, in the best way possible, mess in World of Warships for the more modern look. All joking aside, however, Cesare is a pretty well-known ship, including the fact she was transferred to the Soviet Navy in the aftermath of the Second World War. I've covered the reason for this in my Axis War Prize video, which I'll link in the description. The Cliff Notes version is the Red Navy wanted any modern ships they could get their hands on, or at least any capable warships at all. This would see them obtain several German and Japanese warships, but also some Italian ones. The most notable, of course, being Cesare and Duca d'Aosta, Novorossiysk and Kerch, as they were respectively renamed. The history of the latter is covered in the aforementioned War Prize video. As for the battleship, well, Cesare was handed over in pretty poor shape. The ship had languished for years without proper maintenance, even before the handover. And the Italians were, as could be expected, not exactly happy about giving up the ship. As a result, only the absolutely critical maintenance was performed for the handover. Cesare was made ready to sail, but nothing beyond that. The ship had wartime camouflage, faded as that was, on the superstructure, and the rest of the paint was a mess, put on more to cover rust spots than anything else. And there were plenty of rust spots to go around. Regardless, Cesare, Novorossiysk, was handed over on February 6, 1949 in Albania, where her service in the Red Navy was rough. That service formally began on March 5th of 1949. As you could probably expect, the ship was a maintenance nightmare. Novorossiysk would constantly break down, with various bits of equipment outright failing to operate. This ranged from minor to really quite serious breakdowns. Probably the best visualization of how bad this was comes from the dry dock periods. Between 1949 and 1955, or 6 years if you prefer that, this ship needed no fewer than 8 refits. Most were fairly minor, admittedly, but that's not a good record to have. Even for a ship intended for training future battleship crews, this wasn't a good look. The most notable of these took place in 1953. The machinery had broken down so badly by this point that the Red Navy threw up its hands and basically said, "I give up, tear it all out, and replace everything." The old boilers and turbines, dating back to the 1937 rebuild, were finally replaced. Those had been worn down by 16 years of use and lacking maintenance. So, at bare minimum, the turbines were torn out and replaced with new Soviet models. The boilers might have been replaced too, or just overhauled, but sources aren't entirely clear on that topic. Either way, this was a major investment for what amounted to an obsolete ship, and it was matched by follow-up refits lasting into early 1955 that replaced the anti-aircraft battery and other more minor equipment. All of these different stints in dry dock took their toll. Most of the ship's remaining service was spent in some form of refit. In fact, the last of them ended on March 29th of 1955. This is relevant because on October 29th, 1955, Novorossiysk suffered a massive explosion in Sevastopol. And this is where the story gets complicated. The explosion came at 1:31 a.m. on October 29th. This rang out directly beneath the starboard bow, with estimates ranging as high as 2,600 pounds of TNT equivalent. This not only blew a massive hole into the bottom, it also blasted clean through the interior decks, with the force ultimately venting out just ahead of the forward triple turret. This was fatal damage. Many of the internal frames were broken, and bulkheads were warped, to the point that watertight doors couldn't close, further worsening already severe flooding. This actually wouldn't be surprising, because the explosion occurred right where the new bow was grafted on the old one. This was different to the Andrea Doria rebuilds, which built an entirely new bow. Cesare's rebuild saw the Italians put a new bow over the old one. This is also relevant to some conspiracy theories later on. For now, the situation aboard the ship was understandably chaotic. Upwards of 3,500 tons of water had entered the battleship by the time the crew tried to move her. With a starboard list developing, the old warhorse had her anchor chains cut. Tugs began to tow the ship to shore, while the list continued to worsen. Despite this, the situation seemed under control. The list wasn't developing at a rapid rate, and the commander of the Black Sea Fleet believed the ship would settle upright. In fairness, the commander, Admiral Alexandrovich Parkhomenko, had good reason to believe that. Sevastopol's harbor was quite shallow in that area. However, it was deceptive because the harbor also had soft mud and silt for the bottom, down to as deep as 15 meters. Moreover, the admiral was operating on the assumption that only about 1,200 tons of water had entered the ship. Bad, but not catastrophic. Unfortunately for the crew of Novorossiysk, the situation began to worsen. By 3:25 a.m., men were being pulled off. However, the admiral, by now in charge of the salvage operation, refused to let all the crew, or at least those not involved in damage control, be removed. He was still convinced the ship would sink upright, and that evacuation would cause unnecessary panic. This led to upwards of 800 men being left on the deck as the ship continued to list. They were just moved back towards the midships area because the boiler rooms had yet to flood. In fact, the ship even made an effort to build up steam. Through it all, that list grew worse, and at some point, it began to shift from starboard to the port side. By 3:50, the list had reached 11 degrees to port and was increasing at a rapid pace. By 4 a.m., it had reached 17 degrees. Then, 10 minutes later, it passed the 18-degree stability limit. And at 4:14, as men jumped overboard, the ship reached 21 degrees to port before suddenly rolling over entirely. This threw men around and made the safe spaces no longer safe. Only about 3 hours after the explosion, Novorossiysk had collapsed to port, and she would continue to settle deeper into the mud as the day went on. That sudden shift to port at some point was probably due to flooded compartments and shifting of water as the ship sank. Either way, the battleship was on the bottom, and 608 or 609 Soviet sailors went down with her. Around 100 in the initial blast, and the rest from the sinking. The worst peacetime disaster in Soviet naval history. Almost immediately after the sinking, an inquiry began into what caused it. It was quickly apparent that the blast wasn't due to faulty shells or powder. The closest magazine, that of A turret, was intact. The wreck itself also indicated an external explosion. The damage to the bottom included plates bent inwards. An internal explosion would have bent those outwards. Furthermore, the damage pattern mentioned earlier fits an external explosion. The blast blew up from the bottom before venting from the top. There was no indication of an internal detonation blowing out in all directions. Granted, I'm not an explosive expert by any stretch of the imagination. So, if anyone in the comments is and can dispute the point, by all means let me know. I'm always open to new information. From my own understanding, and from reading, it does seem like the explosion does not match an internal one. In any event, this investigation, by General Vyacheslav Malyshev, found their culprit, specifically an unexploded German mine left over from when they evacuated occupied Sevastopol. This would have been an RMH magnetic mine, basically a wooden box filled with about 2,000 pounds of TNT equivalent, pretty close to the estimated force of the blast. The Germans put a lot of these mines into the harbor. The Soviets swept the harbor multiple times from 1945 through to 1951. And yet, after a further sweep in the aftermath of the sinking, they still found more, including 3 within 50 meters of Novorossiysk's mooring. Now, this theory is not without flaws. Those mines should have been inactive 11 years after they were placed. Outliers are certainly possible, of course, and Italian Battleships speculates that maybe that particular mine had a malfunction after it was laid, which was cleared the night Novorossiysk moored above it, prompting it to finally detonate. The mine theory is also supported by the presence of a large crater in the bottom right beneath the damage. This is all speculation, mind you. The mine theory isn't perfect, not least because other ships, and Novorossiysk herself, had moored there before, and the mine was past the point its fuse should have failed. Nonetheless, it is the most likely, especially in the face of how outlandish the conspiracy theories can get. These typically revolve around the Italians, the most common being the claim that bitter Italian frogmen repeated their success against Valiant and Queen Elizabeth. These men would have snuck into the harbor, placed explosives, and detonated them. This is typically based on claims by various Italians over the years, and by Giulio Borghese, who planned the attack on the British ships. He became a politician after the war, who notably swore vengeance on the Soviet Navy. However, this entire situation is right out of a James Bond movie, and not in the realistic way. This would have required those Italians to sneak across the Black Sea into Sevastopol. Not just that, but to get past all security measures with a massive pile of explosives, along with the equipment to carry it, most likely mini submarines. The frogmen would then have to place the explosives, get out, and do it all without being caught or leaving any evidence behind. Let's ignore for the moment that the Italian government would have been very silly to authorize something like this. The ex Cesare was useless and a relic, not worth the effort over a decade after the war had ended. Let's say instead that this was instigated by naval officers, probably retired ones, and without the government's authorization. That makes it even less likely because now you've got both the Soviets and the Italian government somehow not catching wind of this. And the Turkish government too, because they would have had to pass by the Bosporus. It boggles the mind to think that frogmen could pull off sinking into and out of the harbor without any conclusive evidence ever coming to light. There's an article by the U.S. Naval Institute that does note a KGB operative claiming to have found a magnetic mine at Kerch, the ex-Italian cruiser's berth, set to explode on November 7th, the anniversary of the October Revolution. However, I've never seen this mentioned anywhere else, so take that with a heaping pile of salt, especially with Russian records being what they are. Now, there were lapses in security. Both books and the aforementioned article note this, but lapses in security does not equate to Italians bomb the ship, and all of this seems to originate with a Russian author in the 1990s, V.A. Karsavin. While this did find these security lapses, it's still incredibly hard to believe the Italians pulled this off. In any case, to wrap up the conspiracy theories, there's also the claim there were 2 explosions. This is typically cited to claim the Bond villain Frogman only placed a small charge on the hull. This was placed beneath the joint in the old and new bows, because the Italians had hidden a massive charge there where the Soviets wouldn't think to look. This hadn't gone off as planned, so the frogmen went in. They detonated a smaller charge, which cooked off the larger one. This is also rather unlikely, both that the Soviets never found this during all those refits, or that the Italians would do this in the first place. Any ships lost to sabotage had to be replaced. That was part of the treaty. If they had done this with the intention of it happening sooner, they'd just lose another battleship. Not to mention, again, the explosion looks like an external one, not an internal blast. That said, this is still less outlandish than claims that the British were the ones to mine the ship. For some reason, I guess? Let me be clear here. These theories of sabotage can't be ruled out entirely. This is a mystery that can probably never be solved. However, it strains my belief to the breaking point to accept the plot of a Bond film as the actual culprit. The mine theory isn't perfect, but it makes a lot more sense. As for the internal explosion, or the British option, those seem to primarily be the Russian equivalent of bored military bloggers. I haven't found a single serious source even remotely supporting this. But, as it does crop up here and there, I figured it was worth mentioning, because if I didn't, it would probably pop up in the comments, even though it's a Mount Everest of salt. Regardless, that brings us to the end of the sinking. Let's take a brief look at the salvage to round things off, and for those here for the shipwreck itself. This began by burrowing tunnels beneath the hull. This would allow cables to run around the ship for the salvage process. You can see the pipeline for the sluice used here to create those tunnels, and the structure built atop the hull to help with the salvage. Meanwhile, holes were drilled into the hull to pump in compressed air, while other openings, including inside the blast damage, were made watertight, either by welding or with concrete. This was by no means an easy process. Just looking at the hole where the blast damaged the ship makes that apparent. You can see how deep that went and how big it was. Also, for that matter, the inward bent plates. Even the port side seen here was pretty beat up, from both blast damage and from bulkheads failing as the ship turned over. While the shape of the stem is apparent, the rest of the ship is caved in, right, again, around where the new bow was grafted on the old. Before we reach the refloating, there's also this picture of the stern, where you can see part of the ship cut open to try and rescue men stuck below decks. This effort did save 7 sailors, although only those 7. As for the salvage itself, we can see that start here, including the compressed air tanks and hoses. The ship itself is barely visible beneath all of this. You can see the pontoons attached to the cables beneath the ship. You can see tugs, tanks, and hoses, but only part of the hull here is visible. This effort took 24 compressors and 4 hours, and proved to be a success. The Soviets pulled the ship from the bottom, although they made no effort to right the hulk. She remained upside down, much like her sister ship Leonardo da Vinci, decades before. Although, as you can see here with the ship under tow, it wasn't that far out of the water. The props are still almost underwater at this point. Still, the ship was afloat, and could be moved to a new mooring where the hull could be scrapped. Structures were erected atop the hull as crews began to cut in. You can see those structures here, along with the inward bent plates here. You can also see more of the buckled port side and the blast damage in this shot. It's not pretty, even with the ship off the bottom. As for the actual salvage work, that focused on the ammunition first. You can see them cutting into the hull to access the magazines, which shows completely intact shell storage with the shells still in place. I'm not sure which magazine this is, admittedly, but still. No explosion here. Once that ammo was out, the rest of the hulk was scrapped. You can't see much detail here other than how that process was done in the harbor, including what looks like a couple waterborne cranes. This shot, on the other hand, is striking. That new bow lifted out of the water and resting vertically. It's much like the similar shot from the Tirpitz wreck. A sad end for a proud ship, by all accounts. The last picture for its part is of the main guns, one of the twin turrets to be specific. These were apparently intact enough that they could have been used as shore artillery. However, this was never done, and the guns were scrapped with the turrets sometime in the 1970s. Thus ends the story of Giulio Cesare and of Novorossiysk, a mystery that will probably never be solved, and a ship that sank in a foreign harbor well after her war had ended. Although, as a final postscript, as could be expected, metaphorical heads rolled after this was done. Many officers were punished for the failures in saving the ship, up to and including the head of the Soviet Navy itself, Admiral Kuznetsov, who was forced into retirement. He was later rehabilitated, but it's worth noting. Now, with this Soviet mess sorted out, we come to the final topic for today. A midpoint between Leo and Cesare, and one that takes us to Japan. More specifically, Japan in 1943. At this point of the war, the Japanese Navy was still a going concern. Battered and bruised, but not yet out of the fight. It's what makes the sudden loss of the battleship Mutsu so very shocking. One of Japan's most powerful battleships blowing apart in an instant, in a protected harbor where she should have been safe. It's what made the sinking such a controversy at the time, one that has never definitively been solved either. It should be noted that this story is a complex one. On June 8, 1943, Mutsu was anchored in Japanese waters. The ship was playing host to visiting aviation cadets and their instructors when out of nowhere a massive explosion broke her in two. This originated in or around the number 3 magazine and sank the ship quickly with only 353 survivors. 1,121 crew, along with most of the visitors, were lost. The origin of the explosion is the complicated bit. Explanations for this explosion range from submarine attack to issues with Type 3 anti-aircraft shells. The famous beehive shells designed to allow big guns to engage aircraft, the actual utility of which is debatable at best. Regardless, the argument at the time was issues in production leading to a fire. What the IJN eventually landed on, however, was internal sabotage by a possibly suicidal sailor. This was based on witness testimony, though how accurate that is remains something of an open question. The unnamed gunner's mate was apparently accused of petty theft and due to be court-martialed. The supposed witnesses claim the man was suicidal and could have started the fire. Then again, there's other survivor testimonies arguing the man was setting the fire as a distraction to escape the ship. We'll never know for sure, though all of this should seem rather familiar. It's a bit of a habit of navies to blame issues like this on disgruntled sailors. You only need to look to USS Iowa for another example. An example that has become something of a classic case of Navy trying to cover its own fault by blaming someone who can't defend himself, even though that man was definitely not responsible for the explosion. In Mutsu's case, we'll never know one way or another. The evidence is long gone, as are the survivors. More recently, there have been arguments made that it was an accidental fire or something of that nature. But again, we'll never know. Now, with that out of the way, on to the wreck. Or rather, the salvage of the wreck. There's no surviving photos of the wreck on the bottom that I'm aware of, at least before the salvage. There really isn't much left of the wreck today. The vast majority of it was pulled up in the 1970s, leaving only 114 feet because Mutsu is in shallow water. Diving the wreck doesn't show much in the way of detail. What little I've found is very, very silty and low visibility. The two pictures here come from a Japanese newspaper circa 2003. Even here, 22 years ago, you can see how rough the remaining wreck was. As she is in shallow water, Mutsu is falling apart about as quickly as you'd expect. Sea life has thoroughly colonized the wreck, and the steel is rusting away. I imagine that has progressed even more. How much more, I'm not sure, because I haven't been able to find anything more recent than this, outside of blurry YouTube footage, and not even much of that. So, with this in mind, let's look instead to the salvage of the wreck, which is more interesting because the salvagers brought up some massive pieces of this battleship, instead of simply cutting it into scrap. Although, two things to clarify first. The turret from Mutsu that you can visit in Japan today is one of the original turrets. That was pulled off during the 1930s refit and eventually turned into a museum. The turrets that she went to war with pulled up during the salvage were all scrapped, at least as far as I'm aware of. And secondly, Mutsu was very much a war grave. She took over 1,000 men down with her. If we were talking the 21st century, I doubt the Japanese government would have allowed this kind of operation, no matter how much she was blocking docking space. However, suffice it to say, the 1970s were a very different time. As for a comparison to modern illegal salvage, well, Mutsu was sunk in Japanese waters, and it was the Japanese who broke her up, with full governmental support. Not quite the same thing. That out of the way, let's begin with those turrets. First, we have turret 4. This was the sternmost turret and has less pictures than the others. Here you can see it pulled from the water upside down. I admittedly find it impressive the salvage operation could bring it up in one piece like this. Of course, since it was pulled up like that, there was quite a bit of water left inside the turret. You can see that pouring out from the barrels. There's probably a lot of contaminants in that water as well. Once it was high and dry, the turret was left in place and, as far as I've been able to find, broken up. While it was sitting on land, though, another picture was taken. This is a close-up shot of the turret face, barrels and all. It's impressive to look at, mostly because of how intact it really is. While turret 4 wasn't the epicenter of the explosion, it was still pretty close, and it was underwater for 30 years. Yet, some rusting aside, the turret is in pretty good shape here. There's probably some damage and such, but it's not like the turret is a mess of shattered steel. What is a mess of twisted steel is this image, which seems to be turret 4 being broken up. That said, the really striking pictures of a turret come from one of the others. Here you can see one being pulled from the water. Again, it's quite something to see a 16-inch gun turret just lifted out of the water like this. This turret is a bit different as well in that it has a rangefinder mounted on top. As impressive as that picture is, there's still a more distinctive one. Here you can see the scale of one of those turrets far better. There's nothing quite like some random people in position next to it to drive home just how massive those are. If you've ever had the good fortune to visit one of the battleship museums, you can get some idea of this. Although not quite the same idea as staring at one resting on its side out of the water. The other pictures of this turret aren't quite as distinctive due to a lack of people in frame. Now, don't get me wrong, there's still something to be said for, as one example, seeing the turret like this, with all the piping and such still visible, along with the rusted metal. This is also an angle you don't normally see, the underside of a turret, which is normally either buried deeply in the ship or underwater where few people can see it. That aside, for the remaining two pictures, we have angles from two different directions. First, a look at it from behind. Here you can see the entire turret resting on its side. The rangefinder is clearly defined at the top, leading down to the curve of the turret itself. The difference in color is clearly visible, which I believe to be because of paint. The upper level would have been painted to protect it from the elements in a way the lower level wasn't. Regardless, the difference in color and rust pattern is very clearly visible. The final image of this turret, meanwhile, comes from the front. Here, the way it was resting on the bottom can be seen. A dark part on the turret, in stark contrast to the rust red of the other parts. This is likely a result of the turret being buried in the mud. It's also an angle that lets you see the guns themselves, one still pointing straight out, even on its side, and the other bent a bit out of shape. The website these came from lists this as Turret 3. If that's the case, I'm legitimately impressed how intact the thing is, considering this was the center of the explosion. However, that does round out the turrets. The rest of the pictures won't be quite as distinctive, although they are interesting in their own right. For instance, this one here. The extreme front of Mutsu's bow. Everything ahead of the first turret was pulled out of the water in more or less one piece. And in this picture, you can see it inverted on the ground. The mounting point for the imperial crest clearly visible. The chrysanthemum itself is, of course, missing. That's unfortunate, but the bow itself is still pretty intact here. Upside down it may be, you can see the line of the bow, where it comes to a point and where that point spreads out as the hull widens from the extreme forward end. Now the second picture of the bow is definitely not as pretty. Here you can see it from the side, which shows how big the piece they brought up was, even after it had already begun being scrapped in place. You have the top of the bow resting on the ground, curving all the way to the keel before moving back into twisted metal as the salvagers took Mutsu's wreck apart. What's really interesting about this picture, other than the whole her bow was out of the water thing, is where they broke up the shell plating. It gives a look inside Mutsu's hull that is almost unique to my knowledge. You don't really see a battleship like this unless it's in a scrapyard. And even then, they don't break it up quite like this. Moving on, this picture is another part of the wreck entirely, judging from both the orientation and the bilge keel on the bottom. If this were the same piece of hull, that would have been towards the top. In any event, this picture also provides a look inside Mutsu's hull, but a different one from the last one. Instead of looking in from the side, this one looks in from the back. This isn't actually that unique of a shot. Ships can and have been scrapped like this. Generally speaking, though, that would be a merchant ship of some variety. Seeing a battleship like this, on the other hand, is a far more unique and special picture. Unfortunately, the photo quality doesn't allow for making out much more detail. As for this picture here, I won't spend much time on it. What this amounts to is a closer view of Mutsu's interior as she was being scrapped. However, that's about it. There's no distinguishing features or notable details. What makes this one worth including is simply the fact you can see the internal frames. That just leaves two more pictures that I'm not quite sure of the location of. In the original video, I said the bow. In hindsight, I think this is actually the stern, mostly because the bow is inverted in the other pictures and clearly isn't here. Either way, this one is a view of the top of the wreck. The deck is remarkably intact, all things considered, with the shape still recognizable. In fact, the overall condition of this piece is impressive. The form of the ship remains intact, and if you show this picture to someone, they might be able to guess which part of the ship it is. Admittedly, it doesn't show very much, so let's move to the final picture of this section of the ship. There's even less in the way of detail to see here. It's a very cropped picture of men working on the hull. Even with that in mind, there's a couple things to note here. First, the portholes. While the covering seems to be long gone, the portholes themselves are still in place. The hull hasn't broken along those holes, and they still look much the same as they would have when Mutsu was on the surface, corrosion and damage aside. The second thing to note about this image is the men working underneath. Who even knows how many thousands of tons of compromised steel? I know this was the 1970s and 1970s Japan at that, but you could not pay me enough to be one of those men. With that terrifying image in mind, that wraps up this bit and leaves only Mutsu's stern, 100% the stern, to cover, which was brought up in one piece like the bow. In this first picture, that is pretty apparent. This seems to be after they broke up the stern, but the overall shape is still there. Much like the bow, what's left of the ship is resting on its side. What makes it clear this is the stern section is the presence of Mutsu's rudders. Those are visible at the bottom of the wreck here and stick out a bit like a sore thumb. This is another case of, I'm impressed how intact it is. The rudders could very easily have fallen off as the wreck was raised, but they remained in place, with the second picture of the stern further driving this home. Even more of the wreck has been scrapped by the time this was taken, but as a side view, you can see more of the defining features. Not so much a rudder, but the propeller and the shaft bracket, helpfully marked on the picture so you know what you're looking at. By the way, that propeller, the bracket, and the shaft were preserved as the rest was scrapped. However, in the intervening years, I think the shaft has been lost. At least the propeller is still around, as seen here. Regardless, we now come to the final picture of Mutsu's salvage. The website lists this as hull bottom, which from the bilge keel towards the bottom of the picture would seem to be the case. This shows more of the internal framing and decks, along with how relatively little rust there was at the time. It doesn't show much beyond that, however. As such, I'll wrap up this video with a set of pictures. These are pieces of Mutsu that you can still see, like the propeller I showed a little bit back. First, you have one of the main guns. Several of these 16-inch guns have survived at various museums across Japan. You can walk up to them and see how big they were, although without the ship or turrets, some of the scale is lost. Secondly, we have one of the 5.5-inch secondary guns, the best surviving example of one of those weapons, which is a good legacy for Mutsu. It's important to look at things like this to remember exactly what was being used to fight the wars of the past. And finally, we have the original number 4 turret. This was restored and open to the public as the only example of a Japanese battleship turret newer than Mikasa. It wasn't a turret that saw war. All of those are gone. Even so, this lonely turret is the best example of Japanese battleship engineering left outside of models. It shows the scale of Mutsu and is a stark reminder of how powerful these ships were in their day and age. And with that, we've reached the end of this video. It's often forgotten, I think, how important the salvage of wrecks can be, especially with these ships destroyed in port. The destruction has overshadowed the efforts to salvage the wrecks. A shame when you think about it, because those efforts were quite important in their own regard. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.